الله 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 لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله لا إله إلا الله سيدنا محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم. آمين. فاتحة. Bismillah, we're reciting. I haven't shared a link yet, but we're reciting where we normally start each morning on page 133 or 4 in that soft khulasa from the khulasa, whatever khulasa you have, and it is invocations after the Fajr prayer as the heading. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alif Lam Mim. ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون والذين يؤمنون بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك وبالآخرة هم يوقنون أولئك على هدى من ربهم وأولئك هم المفلحون وإلهكم إله واحد لا إله إلا هو الرحمن الرحيم اللهم إني أقدم إليك بين يدي كل نفس ولمحة ولحظة وخطرة وطرفة يطرف بها أهل السماوات والأرض وكل شيء هو في علمك كائن أو قد كان أقدم إليك بين يدي ذلك كله الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض ولا يؤوده حفظهما وهو العلي العظيم لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وإن تبدوا ما في أنفسكم أو تخفوه يحاسبكم به الله فيغفر لمن يشاء ويعذب من يشاء والله على كل شيء قدير آمن الرسول بما أنزل إليه من ربه والمؤمنون كل آمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله لا نفرق بين أحد من رسله وقالوا سمعنا وأطعنا غفرانك ربنا وإليك المصير نفسا إلا وسعها لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا وأخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين آمين. شهد الله أنه لا إله إلا هو والملائكة أولو العلم قائما بالقسط لا إله إلا هو العزيز الحكيم. وأنا أشهد بما شهد الله به وأشهد الله على ذلك وأستودع الله هذه الشهادة وهي لي عند الله وديعة أسأله حفظها حتى يتوفاني عليها إن الدين عند الله الإسلام قل اللهم مالك الملك اللهم مالك الملك تؤتي الملك من تشاء وتنزع الملك ممن تشاء وتعز من تشاء وتذل من تشاء بيدك الخير إنك على كل شيء قدير تولج الليل في النهار وتولج النهار في الليل وتخرج الحي من الميت وتخرج الميت من الحي وترزق من تشاء بغير حساب رحمن الدنيا والآخرة ورحمهما تعطي من تشاء منهما وتمنع من تشاء أنت ترحمنا فارحمنا رحمة تغننا بها رحمة من سواك اللهم اقض عنا الدين واغننا من الفقر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد
لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل أعوذ برب الفلق من شر ما خلق ومن شر غاسق إذا وقب شر النفاثات في العقد ومن شر حاسد إذا حسد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل أعوذ برب الناس ملك الناس إله الناس
من شر الوسواس
الخناس الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس من الجنة والناس. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم
مالك يوم الدين
إياك نعبد
وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everyone online. And if anyone's just arrived in the handout that has been shared, we are on page 145 for the heading of the word of Sayyidina al-Sheikh Abu Bakr bin Salim, and the transliteration is on the next page. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم يا عظيم السلطان يا قديم الإحسان يا دائم النعم يا كثير الجود يا واسع العطاء يا خفي اللطف يا جميل الصنع يا حليما لا يعجل صل يا ربي على سيدنا محمد وآله وسلم وعن الصحابة أجمعين. اللهم لك الحمد شكرا ولك المن فضلا وأنت ربنا حقا ونحن عبيدك رقا وأنت لم تزل لذلك أهلا. يا ميسر كل عسير ويا جابر كل كسير ويا صاحب كل فريد ويا مغني كل فقير ويا مكوي كل ضعيف ويا مأمن كل مخيف. يسر علينا كل عسير فتيسير العسير عليك يسير. اللهم يا من لا يحتاج إلى البيان والتفسير حاجاتنا كثير وأنت عالم بها وخبير. اللهم إني أخاف منك وأخاف ممن يخاف منك وأخاف ممن لا يخاف منك. اللهم بحق من يخاف منك نجنا ممن لا يخاف منك. اللهم بحق سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم احرسنا بعينك التي لا تنام واكنفنا بكنفك الذي لا يرام وارحمنا بقدرتك علينا فلا نهلك وأنت ثقتنا ورجاؤنا. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. والحمد لله العالمين عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته. اللهم إنا نسألك زيادة في الدين وبركة في العمر وصحة في الجسد وسعة في الرزق وتوبة قبل الموت وشهادة عند الموت ومغفرة بعد الموت وعفوا عند الحساب وأمانا من العذاب ونصيبا من الجنة وارزقنا النظر إلى وجهك الكريم. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه من ذلك كلماته يا الله. وإلى حضرة النبي سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم. الفاتحة. بسم الله. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Those online, we have reached the word of Latif of Imam Haddad. That in the Khulasa handout is page 151 for Arabic, 152 for transliteration.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل أعوذ برب الفلق من شر ما خلق ومن شر غاسق إذا وقب نفاثات في العقد ومن شر حاسد إذا حسد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل أعوذ برب الفلق من شر ما خلق ومن شر غاسق إذا وقب ومن شر النفاثات في العقد ومن شر حاسد إذا حسد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل أعوذ برب الفلق من شر ما خلق ومن شر غاسق إذا وقب ومن شر النفاثات في العقد ومن شر حاسد إذا حسد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل أعوذ برب الناس ملك الناس إله الناس الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس من الجنة والناس بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل أعوذ برب الناس ملك الناس إله الناس من شر الوسواس الخناس الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس من الجنة والناس بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل أعوذ برب الناس ملك الناس إله الناس من شر الوسواس الخناس الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس من الجنة والناس ربي أعوذ بك من همزات الشياطين وأعوذ بك ربي أن يحضرون ربي أعوذ بك من همزات الشياطين وأعوذ بك ربي أن يحضرون همزات الشياطين وأعوذ بك ربي أن يحضرون فحسبتم أنما خلقناكم عبثا وأنكم إلينا لا ترجعون فتعالى الله الملك الحق لا إله إلا هو رب العرش الكريم ومن يدعو مع الله إلها آخر لا برهان له به إنما حسابه عند ربه إنه لا يفلح الكافرون وقل رب اغفر وارحم وأنت خير الراحمين فسبحان الله حين تمسون وحين تصبحون وله الحمد في السماوات والأرض وعشيا وحين تظهرون يخرج الحي من الميت ويخرج الميت من الحي الأرض بعد موتها وكذلك تخرجون أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم
لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن
على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله وتلك الأمثال نضربها للناس لعلهم يتفكرون هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو عالم الغيب والشهادة هو الرحمن الرحيم هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون هو الله الخالق البارئ المصور له الأسماء الحسنى يسبح له ما في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم سلام على نوح في العالمين إنا كذلك نجزي المحسنين إنه من عبادنا المؤمنين أعوذ بكلمات الله التامات من شر ما خلق أعوذ بكلمات الله التامات من شر ما خلق أعوذ بكلمات الله التامات من شر ما خلق بسم الله الذي لا يضر مع اسمه شيء في الأرض ولا في السماء وهو السميع العليم بسم الله الذي لا يضر مع اسمه شيء في الأرض ولا في السماء وهو السميع العليم بسم الله الذي لا يضر مع اسمه شيء في الأرض ولا في السماء وهو السميع العليم اللهم إني أتبعت منك في نعمة وعافية وستر فأتم نعمتك علي وعافيتك وسترك في الدنيا والآخرة اللهم إني أتبعت منك في نعمة وعافية وستر فأتمم نعمتك علي وعافيتك وسترك في الدنيا والآخرة اللهم إني أتبعت منك في نعمة وعافية وستر فأتمم نعمتك علي وعافيتك وسترك في الدنيا والآخرة اللهم إني أتبعت أنشدك وأشهد حملة عرشك وملائكتك وجميع خلقك أنك أنت الله لا إله إلا أنت وحدك لا شريك لك وأن سيدنا محمدا عبدك ورسولك اللهم إني أصبحت أشهدك وأشهد حملة عرشك وملائكتك وجميع خلقك أنك أنت الله لا إله إلا أنت وحدك لا شريك لك وأن سيدنا محمدا عبدك ورسولك اللهم إني أصبحت أشهدك وأشهد حملة عرشك وملائكتك وجميع خلقك أنك أنت الله لا إله إلا أنت وحدك لا شريك لك وأن سيدنا محمدا عبدك ورسولك اللهم إني أصبحت أشهدك وأشهد
حملة عرشك وملائكتك وجميع خلقك أنك أنت الله لا إله إلا أنت وحدك لا شريك لك، وأن سيدنا محمدا عبدك ورسولك.
الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا يوافي نعمه ويكافئ مزيدا. الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا يوافي نعمه ويكافئ مزيدا.
الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا يوافي نعمه ويكافئ مزيدا. آمنت بالله العظيم وكفرت بالجبت
واستمسكت بالعروة الوثقى لا انفصام لها والله سميع عليم. آمنت بالله العظيم وكفرت بالجبت والطاغوت واستمسكت بالعروة الوثقى لا انفصام لها والله سميع عليم. آمنت بالله العظيم وكفرت بالجبت والطاغوت واستمسكت بالعروة الوثقى لا انفصام لها والله سميع عليم.
رضيت بالله
يا رب بالإسلام دينا وسيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم نبيا ورسولا.
رضيت
بالله ربا بالإسلام دينا وسيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم نبيا ورسولا.
رضيت بالله ربا وبالإسلام دينا وبسيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم نبيا ورسولا. حسبي الله لا إله إلا هو عليه توكلت وهو رب العرش العظيم. حسبي الله لا إله إلا هو عليه توكلت وهو رب العرش العظيم. حسبي الله لا إله إلا هو عليه توكلت وهو رب العرش العظيم. حسبي الله لا إله إلا هو عليه توكلت وهو رب العرش العظيم. حسبي الله لا إله إلا هو عليه توكلت وهو رب العرش العظيم. حسبي الله لا إله إلا هو عليه توكلت وهو رب العرش العظيم. حسبي الله لا إله إلا هو عليه توكلت وهو رب العرش العظيم.
اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم.
اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم
صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم.
اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم.
اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد
وآله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم إني أسألك من فجاءة الخير وأعوذ بك من فجاءة الشر. اللهم أنت ربي لا إله إلا أنت خلقتني وأنا عبدك وأنا على عهدك ووعدك ما استطعت. أعوذ بك من شر ما صنعت. أبوء لك بنعمتك علي وأبوء بذنبي فاغفر لي فإنه لا يغفر الذنوب إلا أنت. اللهم أنت ربي لا إله إلا أنت عليك توكلت وأنت رب العرش العظيم. ما شاء الله كان وما لم يشأ لم يكن.
ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم.
أعلم أن الله على كل شيء قدير وأن الله قد أحاط بكل شيء علما. اللهم إني أعوذ بك من شر نفسي ومن شر كل دابة أنت آخذ بناصيتها. إن ربي على صراط مستقيم. يا حي يا قيوم برحمتك أستغيث ومن عذابك أستجير. أصلح لي شأني كله ولا تكلني إلى نفسي ولا إلى أحد من خلقك طرفة عين. اللهم إني أعوذ بك من الهم والحزن
وأعوذ بك من العجز والكسل
وأعوذ بك من الجبن والبخل وأعوذ بك من غلبة الدين وقهر الرجال. اللهم إني أسألك العافية في الدنيا والآخرة.
اللهم إني أسألك العفو والعافية والمعافاة الدائمة في ديني ودنياي وأهلي ومالي. اللهم استر عوراتي وامن روعاتي.
اللهم احفظني من بين يدي ومن خلفي وعن يميني وعن شمالي ومن فوقي. وأعوذ بعظمتك أن أغتال من تحتي. اللهم أنت خلقتني وأنت تهديني وأنت تطعمني وأنت تسقيني
وأنت تميتني وأنت تحييني وأنت على كل شيء قدير. أصبحنا على فطرة الإسلام وعلى كلمة الإخلاص وعلى دين نبينا محمد
صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم وعلى ملة أبينا إبراهيم
حنيفا مسلما وما كان من المشركين.
اللهم بك أصبحنا
وبك أمسينا
وبك نحيا وبك نموت وعليك نتوكل وإليك النشور. أصبحنا وأصبح الملك لله والحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم إني أسألك خير
هذا اليوم فتحه
ونصره ونوره وبركته وهداه. اللهم إني أسألك خير هذا اليوم وخير ما فيه وخير ما قبله وخير ما بعده. وأعوذ بك من شر هذا اليوم وشر ما فيه وشر ما قبله وشر ما بعده. اللهم ما أصبح بي من نعمة أو بأحد من خلقك فمنك وحدك لا شريك لك. فلك الحمد ولك الشكر على ذلك. سبحان الله وبحمده عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه
وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته.
سبحان الله وبحمده عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته. سبحان الله وبحمده
عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته.
سبحان الله
بحمد عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته.
سبحان الله العظيم
وبحمد عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته.
سبحان الله عدد ما وبحمده عدد خلقه
ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته. سبحان الله عدد ما خلق في السماء.
سبحان الله عدد ما خلق في الأرض.
سبحان الله عدد ما بين ذلك. سبحان الله عدد ما هو خالق. الحمد لله عدد ما خلق في السماء. الحمد لله عدد ما خلق في الأرض. الحمد لله عدد ما بين ذلك. الحمد لله عدد ما هو خالق.
لا إله إلا الله عدد ما خلق في السماء.
لا إله إلا الله عدد ما خلق في الأرض. لا إله إلا الله عدد ما بين ذلك. لا إله إلا الله عدد ما هو خالق. الله أكبر عدد ما خلق في السماء.
الله أكبر
عدد ما خلق في الأرض. الله أكبر عدد ما بين ذلك. الله أكبر عدد ما هو خالق. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم عدد ما خلق في السماء. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم عدد ما خلق في الأرض. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم عدد ما بين ذلك. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم عدد ما هو خالق. لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له.
له الملك وله الحمد.
يحيي ويميت وهو على كل شيء قدير عدد كل ذرة ألف مرة. لا إله إلا الله وحده. رضوان نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته.
آمين.
فاتحة.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم ورضي الله عنكم. It is among the blessings of God upon the callers to God and His religion in these times that as long as they address the people in general, so they are neither reprimanded nor harmed, sometimes also if they are somewhat more specific, unless it be from certain arrogant tyrants in iniquitous heads of state or evil rulers. So let the callers refrain from designating specific persons to steer safe from their rebukes, injuries, and seditions, which they may be too weak to endure, so that they may be troubled, aggrieved, and distressed, and make this an excuse for withholding counsel and a permission to stop calling to truth and religion. Let them emulate the master of all prophets and leaders of all counselors, Muhammad, may God's blessings and peace be upon him. For when he was informed of something distasteful, he never explicitly designated the culprit. Rather, he said, "Why do certain people do such and such a thing?" This was out of tact and gentleness, and the desire to preserve people's loyalty and conceal their blemishes.
طيب بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله العالمين وصلى الله تعالى سيدنا محمد أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه من والعبدين والتعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث والتمسك بكتاب الله سنة الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على الخير ابتغاء وجه الله ومرضاته قربه وثوابه سبحانه وتعالى. Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, wa la ilaha illallah, wallahu al-quwwata al-azim. عدد كتاب الكتب أكتب بلا بدين داخل داخلين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. وحسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العظيم. اللهم إني أعوذ بك من أن أضل أظلم أو أجهل عليه. اللهم اغفر لنا من بالحلم وأكرمنا بالتقوى وتجمل بعافية من الراحمين يا رب الراحمين يا رب الراحمين. طيب, so he left off yesterday. We were talking about how a call to Allah Ta'ala has to have a level of like patience and forbearance dealing with people, how they might, bother him, or they might be bad to him, or they might not accept what he has to say. Similar to what happened to many of the prophets. So amongst the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, sometimes he'll be physically bothered, physically, people might abuse him or hit him or something like that, or they might call him names, or in general, they might have been bad to him. But he bore all that with good character, and ultimately the fruits of that paid off because either they became Muslim eventually or their progeny became Muslim. So now he's saying, from amongst the blessings, the author is saying that from amongst the blessings of the time that we live in, despite all the ignorance, despite people being distant from God, people not even knowing they have to learn about the religion of Allah Ta'ala and practice it, even if they're born Muslim, despite all of that, he said, people can call to Allah Ta'ala and not experience any sort of backlash that's negative or that's difficult to bear. You can call to Allah Ta'ala, you can call people to Islam, you can spread the religion of God, and ultimately, for the most part, in the time period that he's writing about, and which can also is true for our time period, no one really faces persecution for their calling to Allah Ta'ala. Maybe someone might say something to your face that's unpleasant. Maybe someone, might not listen to you, but institutionally, there's no real persecution and people stopping you from calling to Allah Ta'ala. In some eras in time that have passed, people used to be persecuted for calling to Allah Ta'ala. People who were scholars and callers to Allah Ta'ala, people would go after them and, harm them physically or, kidnap them or maybe even kill them because of their spreading of the message of God. But in our time, in the time of the author and also in our time, like what we can see in the Detroit community here, people call to Allah Ta'ala and they don't face any sort of real harm or persecution. The worst they might experience are people being bad to them, having bad manners, having bad character, or just not listening to what they have to say. So what he's saying now, the author is saying that this is a massive blessing from Allah Ta'ala. It's a massive blessing from Allah Ta'ala for some people to have the opportunity to call to Him and not have any sort of backlash or persecution thrown back at them. And because of that, we should take advantage of it, he's saying. We should take advantage of it and not let this opportunity slip by us. And he said the Prophet ﷺ and his good character, if he ever did experience something from the people that was bad, he wouldn't ever single anyone out. So for example, someone be calling to Allah Ta'ala and they might experience something from people, from a specific individual or a few individuals, right? And he wants to address that. His addressing of that would never be in a way where it would make anyone feel bad or break their heart. And it would never be a way where it would single someone out publicly. Okay? So instead of saying, for example, if someone, was bad to him or was bad to people or doing something wrong, he wouldn't say, don't be like so-and-so, he does this, publicly in front of people and shame that person, make them embarrassed, make them feel bad. And, make them potentially even turn away from ever coming back to him, right? What he would do instead was he would, for example, like the hadith mentioned, what he would do, he would say, some people might do this, and this is bad. Or some people do X, Y, Z, and they should instead be doing, 1, 2, 3. Okay? So instead of targeting individual people to do things or, singling them out and making them feel bad, he would just speak generally, and whoever would be doing that thing would hear it and understand he's talking, he's giving me nasiha, he's giving me counsel, and they would act upon it themselves. So amongst the good character or a good strategy for a call to Allah Ta'ala is to be mindful of not exposing people of their faults and not shaming them publicly. So when you speak to people publicly, you should always be general in how you phrase things so no one ever feels that they're being targeted or that they're being shamed or being exposed. Just speak generally, oh, we should be mindful of this, we should be doing this, people who do this should instead be doing this, like that. And people who are doing those things will get the message and they'll act accordingly. And people who aren't doing it won't know that, there are people who are doing it, and, they'll be embarrassed or something. Okay. Now, obviously, there might be cases where someone might have to speak to someone privately, and speak to them privately and maybe, make them become aware of certain things or teach them, a point or two, or give them good counsel. What happens in private, giving someone nasiha in private is different than doing it in public, right? In public, the most important thing is that no one is shamed, no one is singled out or targeted, and no one is exposed for their faults, because all those things are they're not from the character of a Muslim in general, let alone someone who's calling to Allah Ta'ala. God.
His Lord August Bihi described him thus: yours indeed a tremendous character, and we have sent you but as a mercy to all things. And there has come to you a messenger from among yourselves. Grievous to him are your sufferings, solicitous for you, to the believers gentle and compassionate. May God's blessings and peace be upon him. May he increase him in honor and elevation to his nearness, and may he grant us to follow his example thoroughly and emulate him to perfection. As he said, exalted be he, you have in the messenger of God an excellent example for those who hope in God and the last day and remember God in abundance.
Now, he's saying now that Allah Ta'ala, when he described the Prophet ﷺ in the Quran, he always described him as an individual of incredible character. An individual of incredible character and beautiful character. In other narrations that mention the Prophet ﷺ, whether it was people narrating, instances or events they had with him, or meetings they had with him, or people who spoke about him, they always spoke about his beautiful character. And so calling to Allah Ta'ala and spreading the message of Allah Ta'ala is one that is essentially built upon having good character. Okay? Most people, or some people, when they think about calling to Allah Ta'ala, they think about, bringing intellectual arguments to the table. Trying to convince someone logically about something, But a lot of times, that's not a battle that's going to be won. Most people aren't going to be convinced through something like that, or even, willing to listen to something like that. Most people are brought to Islam because of the good character they see in Muslims and the beautiful character they see in Muslims. And that really is how the Prophet ﷺ was as an individual. Some people might be convinced through a logical argument or something intellectual, but most people, it's beautiful character that brings them closer to Allah Ta'ala and brings them closer to God. And the Prophet ﷺ was like that, no matter what people called him, he was called a liar, he was called a sorcerer, he was called this or that, right? But no one, even his worst enemies, ever questioned his character, to the point where they considered him so trustworthy. They might torment him and his people, right? And then immediately ask him to, take care of their money or take care of, their kids or take care of something, they deemed high in value, and they wanted to put in his trust. So no one ever questioned his character. And it was his character that brought people to Islam. People used to look at his face and just know, this is not the face of a liar, this is not the face, this person that I'm looking at. Their beautiful character is shown on their physical attributes, and khalas, they'll be guided to Islam just by seeing him and how he interacts with the people. So having good character is something that goes a long way to call not only in one's own personal salvation, but it goes a long way in calling people to Allah Ta'ala. And it's good character ultimately, especially where we live now in the United States of America, that calls people to God. Not everyone will sit and listen to someone proselytize and speak about religion and speak about God and all these things. In fact, most people, if you bring it up, they feel uncomfortable because of the way society is structured here. They're not used to hearing about these things in public spaces. They want you to just keep it to yourself or at home. But if they see you being a good person and interacting with them beautifully, they'll be called to God. And I think most people who know people who became Muslim or went from being not practicing to practicing, if they were to reflect upon those individuals and think about their experiences, they would find out that most of it is from just good character. They spent time around Muslims. They saw how good they were to either their parents or their neighbors or their friends or their wives or their kids or whoever, right? And they were moved by it, and it brought them to Islam, just like how people were moved by the Prophet ﷺ's character and brought to Islam as well.
It is clear from the above that there can be no excuse and no permission for religious scholars to abandon calling to God, counseling the Muslims, teaching them what they are obliged to know as it concerns obedience to God's orders and refraining from what he has forbidden, and that there is no excuse and no argument for ignorant people not to accept this from them and respond and assimilate what is given. On the contrary, they should take the initiative in seeking knowledge and seriously pursuing it, and should make it a priority over matters of earning a living. Should they fall short of this, the scholars may not remain silent or leave them to their neglect, for they would thus become their equal in negligence, inadequacy, and indifference towards the right of God, the vast, the supreme. The proof of Islam, may God's mercy be upon him, says near the end of the 3rd chapter of the book of enjoining good and forbidding the evils of his Ihya. Know that everyone sitting in his house in these times is not free from some degree of blame for failing to guide the people, teach them, and lead them to good. For most townspeople are ignorant of the Sharia as concerns the conditions of validity of the ritual prayer. So how is it likely to be in the villages and deserts among the Bedouin, the Kurds, the Turkoman, and other such people?
So he's saying now, he's reiterating a point that he makes often. He said that, given everything we've discussed so far, what excuse do scholars and students of knowledge have, and people who have learned their religion, what excuse do they have for not spreading the message of Allah Ta'ala and teaching others? Okay, there's no possible excuse you can have, because you see around you the state of society and individuals, right? And you see how the Prophet ﷺ reacted and spread the message of God, and you see how, in the era that, he wrote about, in the era we live in as well, calling to Allah Ta'ala is not, there's no like persecution, alhamdulillah. There's no, people aren't being, physically tormented for calling to Allah Ta'ala. Generally speaking, right, it's not a path that has a lot of obstacles like that in front of it. It might be difficult in terms of dealing with individuals and people's egos and people being bad to you or not listening, but for the most part, there's no severe persecution happening. People call to God. So given all that, what excuse do people have for not spreading the message? Okay, and furthermore, what excuse do people who are ignorant have for not learning? Right? So both parties have responsibilities. One has a responsibility to call to God, and the other has a responsibility to learn what they don't know and to practice it. Right? So in the modern world nowadays, we can say, well, unfortunately, there aren't as many scholars or students of knowledge as we would like to go around and to be there for communities, right? But what excuse do people have for not turning to Allah Ta'ala and to learn about his religion, given all the means that we have? There are so many websites that stream lessons, so many durus that are online. You can follow people from halfway around the world. You can follow people from your couch, follow the lessons from your couch, follow the majalis from your couch. And so again, what excuse does the one party have for not calling to Allah Ta'ala? And what excuse do the other party have for not learning, given the ease of learning in the modern age as well, right? And given the fact that they know they have to do this and they have to fill in the gaps in what they don't know so they can become closer to Allah Ta'ala. Both parties have responsibilities, and negligence in either part, right? Negligence in either part is harmful to society as a whole. It's harmful to society as a whole because when one party stops teaching and learning, then ignorance increases, right? And when they don't learn, right, they're harming themselves, and society as a whole goes down in terms of their fulfilling the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ.
There must be.
Yeah. So he's saying now as well. He says as well, and he reiterates another point where, in the time we live in, he says, every single individual has a role to play in calling to Allah Ta'ala. So every single Muslim on the face of the earth, right, they're obligated to call people to good and to repel them from bad. To call everyone to good and repel them from bad. If you see something that's not appropriate or that's not right, you have to do something to change it, right? There's a hadith Prophet said that if you see something wrong, either you change it with your hand, or if you can't, with your tongue, or at the very least, you change it with your heart through dua. So if we see something wrong in the world, right, if we have the means to change it, we should change it. And physically changing it might come if someone has authority, right? So for example, someone might be, they might have actual authority, like legislative authority over a land. They should change any bad they see through legislative authority. Or for example, someone in their house, someone's the father of the home, okay? They have actual ability to change something, in the house to their authority. That's what he means by changing something with your hand. You have the authority to change something through policy or rules or something like that, right? Or if you can't do that, then you have the ability to say something, to speak up. So, we might not have legislative authority here, but if we see something wrong in the streets, we can speak up, like, why are you doing that? That's not the best thing to do, right? You give someone to see how a good counsel, you speak up, you speak up even at home amongst your family members and your roommates or your neighbors, you can speak up, okay? And that's the second level of changing something. And so the third level of changing something, which is something that many people might fall into, and a category many people fall into, is that if you can't change it with your hand through authority, or you can't change it with your tongue because you're not in a place where you can say something, right? You just change it with your heart by making dua for that individual. And many times we might find ourselves in situations, here in Detroit, for example, where that's the best we can do. If you were to say something, it might make things worse, right? Or you just know that it'll just, it won't help the individual, might make things, make them more distant from Allah Ta'ala. So at the very least, pray for them and pray that thing is rectified. And so that hadith is a perfect example that tells us, it's a perfect example of the obligatory nature of changing society, the responsibility every Muslim has in changing society. Okay, in changing society. So every single Muslim, right, has a responsibility to make society better. And that responsibility and that the weight of it and the nature of it will change according to the individual and their skills, their talents, their capacity. Okay? So he's saying no Muslim is devoid or free of any responsibility to help change society and their community. Okay? He's saying most people that you'll see, okay, he's saying now in his context, he's saying most people that you see, in the cities, where there are scholars, where there are students of knowledge, they're ignorant of, even the basics of salah. So what about people who live distant from the scholars? Right? So for example, here in Detroit, Michigan, there are a lot of scholars and institutions that teach. You have Al-Rahma, you have other schools, okay? Right? And yet despite all that, in Detroit, there are plenty of those who are ignorant of even the most basic things about salah and fasting, making wudu, right? So what about if you go somewhere in the United States of America where there aren't that many schools or scholars or imams? The ignorance is even more. It's even more. And that's what he's saying. He's saying that if the people around the institutions and the scholars are ignorant, what about if you go somewhere else where there aren't institutions or scholars? They're even more ignorant, right? And he even brings up a point. He says that these ignorant people, he says that for amongst the ignorant or those who need help, he mentions various races as well, right? To show that it's not just specific to a specific race. Ignorance permeates through anyone, right? Permeates through anyone, and everyone needs help, yani. Everyone needs help in this day and age, and it's up to those who see that, tamam, they have to help. Yani. They have to help and do their part in changing the community and the society and the ummah to a better state.
There must be in every mosque and every quarter of the town a jurisprudent, a faqih, to teach the people their religion, and so in every village, every jurisprudent to complete his obligations must devote himself to the kifaya obligations by traveling to the neighboring areas where people like Bedouin and Kurds live, to teach them their religion and the obligations of their sacred law, he should take with him sufficient provision so as to not eat their food, for much of that may be suspicious because of the possibility of it being stolen. When one jurisprudent goes out, he relieves the others of their responsibility. Otherwise, everyone will be in the wrong, the scholars for failing to go out and the ignorant for failing to seek knowledge.
So he's saying now, he mentioned how everyone has a responsibility to serve the da'wah and to help the community and the ummah. Now he's talking about other specific obligations. It is an obligation for the community to have someone who can answer their questions and teach them their religion, a scholar, okay, around and living with them, a communal scholar, someone who's a community resource and can help them with their problems, answer their questions, and teach them about the religion of God. This is an obligation. Yani if a community doesn't provide someone who does that, how do they provide someone who does that? They send, their children to learn. And from amongst their children, someone will get to a point in their knowledge where they can fulfill that communal obligation. If they don't provide that, then everyone in the community is sinful. And that's really, really, neglected nowadays, unfortunately. And if we were to look at it from the Sharia perspective, and Allah, in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ says that, within every about 50 miles, there has to be a scholar who's there for the community to answer their questions and teach them. And if we were to do a survey of just, for example, the United States of America, we'd be falling very short fulfilling that obligation as a community. To provide someone who's a communal resource as a Muslim scholar for every 50 or so miles, right? For every town, you can say, right? And 50 miles around it, we'd be falling very short, we'd be falling very short. So he's saying that this is a communal obligation that, we have to make sure people study enough where some people get to a point where they can become a communal resource and teach the community and answer their questions and be there for them. And if they don't provide that, then everyone in the community is sinful, right? Everyone in the community is sinful because they didn't participate in producing someone like that from amongst themselves, okay? And furthermore, it is a communal obligation as well, or an obligation upon specific scholars to go out and to actually teach those who don't know. So the community has to produce someone who takes this mantle. That's one obligation. And that individual, after they fulfill the obligations upon themselves and they have, to do like for their family and their own personal obligations, they have to actually go out and spread the message of God and teach others. Okay? And if he doesn't do that, then everyone else as well is sinful as well, because the message of God must be spread and people must be taught. Okay? If people who see other people's need for learning don't go out and teach them, who's going to do it then? Who's going to do it? Those people who are in ignorance, and sometimes they have nowhere to go or nowhere to turn to. So we have to go out there and initiate contact and help them, right? So he's saying that those people have to go out and actually help those individuals who might be distant from scholars, further away, or just not even knowing they have to learn. They have to be gone to and they have to be spoken to and taught. And so he says that those individuals, those people whom the communities who can teach, should go out and teach others. And if they have to go out somewhere, basically go on a journey for the sake of Allah Ta'ala and to teach these people, they should do it in a way, okay, where, for example, they're not dependent on the people they're going to. Okay. So for example, if there's, somewhere far away where we hear about, where there are Muslims who need to be taught or helped or something, we should go to them and serve them. But we shouldn't do it in a way where we go there and we're dependent upon them, or we force our needs upon them. So, for example, you might go there and you don't have anything, and you're expecting them to feed you, clothe you, and house you, right? And then instead of being, helpful to them, you're a burden upon them. Okay, that's not a good thing to do, right? Because one, you force yourself on them, right? It's no different than someone inviting themselves to your house, okay? And just, taking advantage of, you have food, you have things to offer, and they just help themselves without any taste or tact. Rather, he says we should go to them, but we should do it in a way where we're not dependent upon them, meaning we bring our own food, we bring our own, means and sustenance. We go there for the sake of Allah Ta'ala. We go there to help them, and we arrange our affairs such that we're not in need of of what they have to offer for us, because number one, that's more likely, that's better in helping them receive the message, right? If someone comes to you, right, with something to tell you nasiha or teaching, but they're also going to force their needs upon you, like, oh, by the way, I need somewhere to stay, I don't have any food, right, I don't have this, I don't have that, then it could irk someone, right, and make them less likely to accept what you have to say. But if you come and you're already self-sustained, then they're more likely to accept what you have to say and take the teachings, number one. Number two, you're not embarrassing them and making them have to feed you or clothe you or house you out of shame. Okay? Out of shame. All right? Because that is also haram. The scholars say if you take something from someone out of shame, it's as if you've stolen it from them. So if there are people, for example, having a meal, okay, and you're around them, you act in a way where they're embarrassed and feel like they have to invite you over to eat with them, right? And then you oblige you to eat with them. It's as if you've taken their food from them, right? Because otherwise, if they weren't embarrassed, they wouldn't invite you. They wouldn't invite you. So to do it in a way where you're tactful, where you arrive and you help them, okay? You arrive and you help them in a way where they're more likely to receive the message positively, and they don't feel like you're being a burden upon them. And the last point he also made was also that to be careful when you go to certain places, because sometimes what they might offer you might not even be halal. If you go somewhere, for example, where there aren't that many Muslims, right? Or maybe there are no Muslims at all, right? And you're expecting them to take care of you. Well, if they're not Muslim, the food they might offer you might not even be halal. So the point is, you arrive and you're self-sustained. Everything you need to fulfill this mission of Allah Ta'ala, you have it on you. And all you have to do is go to them and just be good to them and speak to them. And maybe they'll listen and respond positively.
Every common person who learns the conditions of the ritual prayers become responsible for teaching them to others, or else share in their guilt. It is obvious that no man is born with religious knowledge. The oneness falls upon the learned to teach the others. He who knows one legal ruling is considered learned as far as that ruling is concerned, but the guilt of the scholars is much worse, for they are more capable in that respect and more qualified. Were every craftsman to abandon his craft, life would become disrupted, for they assume responsibility for something that is necessary for the functioning of society. The role of the jurisprudent, his craft, so to speak, is to convey what has reached him from the messenger of God. May God's blessings and peace be upon him, for scholars are the heirs of the prophets. Now a man is not allowed to sit in his house and not go to the mosque simply because he sees that the people there are not praying correctly. On the contrary, once he realizes this, it becomes incumbent upon him to go out and teach them. Similarly, if a person is convinced that in the marketplace a certain kind of reprehensible thing occurs, either constantly or at specific times, and he is capable of changing it, it is not permissible for him to shrug this off by staying at home. On the contrary, he must go out and attempt to change it. If he can change it only partly, but wishes not to go out so as to not be forced to see it, he must try to change that part he is able to. Under such circumstances, witnessing the rest that he cannot change will do him no harm. It is forbidden to go out, lest one should witness forbidden things only when there is no acceptable justification.
So he says, now every individual who's learned a portion of the religion has a responsibility to spread it. So when he talks about scholars, a person who learns, even for example, they learn how to pray properly, right? They're a scholar in praying properly, and they have an obligation to teach people how to pray and to help people if they notice that they don't know how to pray. Okay, so when he says scholars, he means anyone who's mastered or who's learned a specific issue in their religion. Okay, now the responsibility is even stronger, obviously, on someone who has dedicated their life, okay, to learning the religion and spreading it. Okay, because ultimately those people, like what was previously mentioned, They've taken an inheritance from the Prophet ﷺ. They've taken the mantle of sustaining their religion and keeping it alive and reviving it when it needs revival. So those people who, for example, like they've studied full time and they've completed specific books, and they've taken on the mantle of the responsibility of serving the community in this regard. For them, the punishment for leaving the da'wah is even larger, because ultimately, they've assumed this responsibility and they've been given to it by their teachers and by Allah Ta'ala to spread their religion and to keep it alive, and their neglect of that will cause harm in society. Just like how, for example, if someone was trained to be a doctor, okay, and the community needs a doctor, but they don't practice medicine, it'd be harmful. Like, well, why did you go spend 10, 15 years studying this craft of studying medicine? This person had the capacity to do it. They were smart enough. They were hardworking enough. The community invested resources in him, and ultimately he studies it, comes back, and doesn't practice it, even though everyone needs a doctor. He'd be considered, blameworthy for that. So similarly, someone who studied the religion of God, right, and dedicated their life to it, and they're in a position where they've attained responsibility in serving the ummah in this regard, but they neglect to do so, it's going to cause societal problems. It's going to cause societal problems. And so for that reason, the blame is on them further, or even more than normal person or someone who's not a scholar, if they were to not call to Allah Ta'ala. And so he says that every single person who knows there's something wrong happening in the world has a responsibility to help change it in some way, shape, or form. Okay, and you can't just stay at home, right, hoping someone else will change it, or just even worse, which is to just ignore it. Okay, just ignore it. And we see this nowadays, right? Like, how many people do we see? Okay, like, for example, in the United States of America, they protest or they try in some way, shape, or form to change something that they deem to be unethical or to be wrong. And sometimes they're not even Muslim. They're not even Muslim, but they, for whatever their belief system is, they believe that this specific thing is unethical or it's wrong or should be changed, and they'll actually go out of their way, and they'll work really hard to try and change it. These are people who don't believe in God, potentially. They're not Muslim, right? Their belief system is not from revelation, right? And yet they're willing to go to work so hard to change something they deem to be wrong. And so, as Muslims, we should see them, right? And we should see, khalas, like, these are people whose belief system is not based on prophecy, not based on the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and they're willing to go the extra mile to change things in society. If we were to be lazy and stay at home, like, that's embarrassing for us, Like, we know we're on the haqq, We know we're on the truth. We know that our legal code of right and wrong that the Prophet ﷺ came with is the absolute truth that society needs to heal and to prosper. Okay? And so if we let other people have strong determination and try to change society, and we're just sitting at home chilling, like, that's embarrassing, Allah didn't give us the Sharia of the Prophet ﷺ or his Sharia just for us to keep it at home in books on the shelves and to practice it amongst ourselves. No, he gave it to us so we can go out there and change society if we see something needs to be changed. So just as, when we see those people working hard to change things based on whatever they believe, us as Muslims, we have to think long and hard and look at ourselves like, we see things in the world that need to be fixed. We should go out there and help fix it, right? In a way that is in line with the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. We can't afford to just be at home and not do anything. Tamam? And he mentions something now that's really important, that there are some people who say to themselves, well, if I go out there and try to change this, right, well, I'll be exposing myself to XYZ that's bad. Okay, to XYZ thing that's bad. So for example, it might be like, if I go out and call people to Allah Ta'ala in this neighborhood or in this specific place, on the way there, I might see things that are inappropriate or hear things that are inappropriate, right? So I'm just going to not do it altogether. Okay, so there's two things to remember in this type of scenario. The first thing is that if someone can't swim, they shouldn't try to save someone who's drowning. If you can't swim, don't bother trying to save someone who's drowning, because then you'll end up drowning too. You'll have two drowned people instead of just one, right? So if someone's in a position where if they were to go out there, right, those bad things that they see or hear will negatively affect them and their religion and potentially cause them to become worse, Of course, they shouldn't expose themselves to it. That's for sure, right? But if you're not that kind of person, right, where you have a sense of strength, or you can swim, so to speak, and you can help someone who's drowning, then you should go out there and still help them, even though you'll be potentially exposing yourself to things that are bad. There's a principle in the religion, in the Sunnah, that you're allowed to overlook things that are like haram or inappropriate, right, in order to fix something else that's haram and inappropriate. Okay, that's haram or inappropriate. So, for example, someone, for example, can go out, okay, and potentially call people to Islam, even though it means, they might be seeing people who are dressed inappropriately or doing inappropriate things, right? But they can't go, and obviously they can't go out there and try to get them to change their entire lives all at once, but they'll do it step by step. So they'll overlook certain things they're doing that are bad, just to help them rectify other parts in their behavior that are bad. So, for example, many of our shuyukh in Hadramaut, okay, they used to go out and call people to Allah Ta'ala in the villages. And sometimes when they go out in these villages, they'd find people who maybe they would, men and women would mix and to be together in one gathering, or they would sing and dance together to music together, or things like that, or they would be dressed inappropriately, right? So they go out there and they'd go with the intention of calling these people to Allah Ta'ala. And they go out there and they find these people in the States, and there's a lot that needs to be addressed. But they'd focus on the most important things, all right, and prioritize them, and overlook certain things that can be addressed later on. So, for example, they would go and they would find these people who, for example, they might, have an affinity for getting together, men and women singing and dancing together. And they would go there and spend time with them at first and gain their trust. And then over time, right, and again, they would be there with them because they have an intention of addressing something more, something that's of greater priority, which is their overall relationship with Allah Ta'ala, right? And then they would eventually, after gaining their trust, they would suggest things like, reading a mawlid instead of singing and dancing. Okay? And the people would listen to that and read the mawlid with them, and then eventually, they would fall in love with it, and then they'll introduce something else. Okay, now let's do the mawlid, but let's separate men and women this time. Okay? Men on one side, women on another. And just like that, with the gradual steps, they might overlook certain things just to address others. Then eventually, when those things become rectified, address the other things. So the point is, right, someone who says that, I don't want to expose myself to evil, so I'm not going to call to Allah Ta'ala. If that person is someone who can't swim and potentially drown, yeah, they shouldn't bother helping someone who's drowning. Okay, focus on yourself. But otherwise, right, there's absolutely nothing wrong with overlooking certain things, right, or potentially exposing yourself to something bad for the sake of changing something that is a higher priority to be changed. Okay. Go ahead, yeah.
It behooves every.
Take mine.
It behooves every Muslim to begin with his own self, reform it by the regular performance of obligatory acts of worship and the abandonment of all forbidden things, followed by teaching this to the member of his household. Then once this is done, to his neighbors, then his neighborhood, then all his townsmen, then the surrounding areas, then the desert Bedouin, Kurds, and other such like people, and so on to the farthest reaches of the world. When the person that is near assumes this function, he who is far is relieved of the responsibility. Otherwise, anyone capable of it, whether near or far, would be accountable, and this responsibility remains incumbent upon everyone capable of assuming it until there does not remain on the face of the earth a single person who is ignorant of a single obligation of his religion. This is sufficient to occupy to the full he who is anxious for his religion and prevent him from wasting his time in rare details, and delving in depth and in subtle sciences, which are collective or kafaya obligations, and over which individual or more important kafaya obligations take priority. End of the quotation. Let this conclude this blessed introduction, and let us now begin to discourse on the 8 categories, asking God for his help and relying entirely on him.
So he says, not every single Muslim must start with first rectifying themselves and those around them. So for example, you start with your family, those you live with, or your roommates, and eventually your neighbors and your community around you, like your neighborhood block or those around you. Eventually you move from there, like you start with a small circle and you expand further and further and further. And he says that if we were to all do that, if we were to all do this specifically, focus on ourselves and those around us immediately, then those, gradually let the circle grow. What would end up happening is that, the da'wah would be fulfilled, and everyone who needs to be called to Allah Ta'ala would be called to Allah Ta'ala, because everyone's doing their part and addressing those that are immediately around them and those who are around them in their neighborhood and community. Okay? But it's when this is neglected is when people are required not to travel and to, leave their hometown or go to other places to call those to Allah Ta'ala. So the obligation begins with ourselves first and foremost, and those around us who we have, a level of influence over in terms of our household, our neighbors, and our community. And eventually the circle expands, right? And we can take care of more people. And our neglect of that as a community, as an ummah, is what leads to these problems with their imbalances, right? Imbalances in people's states in the society, and a deficiency in scholars who are able to spread the message. And with that, he concludes the introduction, and he continues on to the rest of the book. But the way he structured his introduction is that basically is a summary of the entire book, mashallah. And he just goes into more detail on these following 8 chapters on principles and topics that we spoke about together in this introduction. So we ask Allah Ta'ala to give us tawfiq, that we act upon everything that we've learned together in this introduction, that he rewards the author, Imam Haddad, rewards him, his shuyukh, and his progeny, and his forefathers, makes us people who are given the blessing of his company in this life and the next, makes us people who are able to spread the message of God all over the world. He gives us tawfiq to seek beneficial knowledge, to act upon it, and accepts that from us. Gives us tawfiq to spread it everywhere and make the Prophet happy with us. And that he rewards our shuyukh, our teachers, all those who have rights upon us with our Hadrat al-Nabi.